El Greco, Van Dyck, and French 18th century decorative arts. Some of these projects have been memorable exhibitions, and all have been accompanied by important publications. Each fellow has moved on to prestigious jobs in the United States and abroad, and among our alumni, we now count professors at Vassar College, Tulane University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Oberlin College, and curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, at the Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas, and as far as the Museo de Arte de Ponce in Puerto Rico. Mellon Poulet Fellows have, over the past 14 years, been appointed to some of the most prestigious positions in museums and universities in the field of art history. In 2 cases, fellows have even stayed or returned to the Frick. Both Charlotte Vignon, curator of decorative arts at the Frick, and I were lucky to be awarded the fellowship in 2004-06 and in 2007-09. It is therefore a great pleasure tonight to introduce Aaron Wile, the 13th Poulet Mellon Fellow, who was appointed in 2014. Aaron is a specialist in 18th century French art and a doctoral candidate at Harvard University. He is working on a dissertation entitled Painting, Authority and Experience at the Twilight of the Grand Siècle, in which he explores how the French artists Charles de la Fosse, Jean Jouvenet, Antoine Coypel, and Jean-Antoine Watteau confronted the shifting ground of political, intellectual, and cultural authority at the end of the reign of King Louis XIV. His wonderful article, Watteau, Rêverie and Selfhood, in the Art Bulletin, was awarded the 2015-16 James L. Clifford Prize for the best article on any aspect of 18th century culture by the American Society for 18th Century Studies. Between 2013 and 2014, Aaron was a fellow at the Centre Allemand d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris before coming to the Frick. As chief curator at the Frick, one of the greatest pleasures of being in this institution is to work closely with talented young curators such as Aaron. I feel that his time as Poulet Fellow has been very important for him, but also that the curatorial department as a whole has learned a lot from him. The wonderful and poignant exhibition, Watteau's Soldiers, Scenes of Military Life in 18th Century France, has been the result of Aaron's research over the past 2 years. The exhibition just opened to the public this morning, and the accompanying catalogue is a comprehensive, intellectually challenging, and ultimately poetic study on the subject. It is often said that art historians tend to resemble the subject they study. I have to confess that over the last 2 years, I often thought of this in Aaron's case. Like Watteau and his soldiers, Aaron is deeply thoughtful, subtle, and a very refined art historian, and his arguments are always stimulating. Tonight's lecture, Watteau, Making as Meaning, will focus on the exhibition and will explore in detail the problem of representing soldiers and their interiority in the artist's work. I would like to remind you that tonight's lecture will be streamed live on our website, and it will be available for later viewing online. I would also like to ask you at this time to please turn off all your cell phones. And finally, following tonight's lecture, you will have the opportunity to visit the Watteau exhibition downstairs in the galleries until 7:30. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Wile.
Thank you for that introduction, Xavier. And I think I'm probably a little less melancholy than Watteau was reputed to have been, if only slightly. Let's see. There we go. We know Jean-Antoine Watteau as a painter of fêtes galantes, a dreamer of amorous aristocrats and melancholy actors. Few artists would seem further removed from the misery of war. And yet early in his short career, Watteau painted a number of military scenes, about a dozen paintings and about 30 surviving drawings. For the most part, these works were executed during the War of the Spanish Succession, which saw the French King Louis XIV battle almost against the whole of Europe in his bid to place his grandson, Philippe, Duc d'Anjou, on the Spanish throne. Watteau himself had close contact with the hardships caused by the war. In 1710, around when he began making his military works, he returned to his hometown Valenciennes in northwestern France. Just months before, the Battle of Malplaquet, the bloodiest battle of the 18th century, had been fought not far from the city. And yet, despite Watteau's exposure to the worst of the War of the Spanish Succession, neither the specifics of the war nor the misery it caused held much interest for him, and neither did the battles itself. Instead, Watteau focused on the most prosaic aspects of military life: marches, halts, and encampments. The resulting works show the quiet moments between the fighting, moments of listlessness, fatigue, simple diversions, when soldiers could rest and daydream, smoke pipes, and play cards. In this, Watteau drew inspiration from 17th century Dutch and Flemish genre scenes of military life by artists such as David Teniers the Younger, and especially Philips Valverman, whose work enjoyed a vogue among collectors in early 18th century Paris. And it's worth pointing out that Watteau came from an area that had only recently become part of France and had been part of Flanders, and in the 18th century he was known as a peintre flamand, a Flemish painter. Despite its kinship with these northern genre scenes, however, Watteau's work, I would suggest, is set apart from its precedents by its intimate, humane vision of war. We have the sense in these works of encountering real people, defined not by their role as soldiers, but by the essentially human experiences of boredom, camaraderie, and reflection. They seem to be endowed with inner life, with subjectivity. I'm not the first to note Watteau's distinctive vision. The historian Arlette Farge, for example, has written that Watteau paints the private interior space that emerges in human beings in war. But what does it mean exactly to depict such a space? What does Watteau actually show us? Tonight, I will argue that what drives the artist's interest in military life is the way war, as an extreme circumstance outside the bounds of civil society, heightens and tests the primal relationship on which society itself is founded, the relationship between self and other. At their core, his drawings and paintings wrestle with what it means to encounter other people in the world, to come face to face with the subjectivity of another. Far from making the experience of the soldier open for identification, they lay bare how alien that experience can be. An inviolable gap separates each self from every other self in Watteau's world. The inner lives of his military men are presented as opaque, inscrutable, unknowable. This vision of self that I propose penetrates Watteau's entire artistic process, structuring in a fundamental way how he went about making his art. And along these lines, my talk will trace the steps of the artist's working method, exploring the imbrication of his process with his vision of the social and psychic life of war. Drawing and interiority. Before he conceived a painting, Watteau drew. He was, the 18th century connoisseur and art historian Desailliers d'Argentville tells us, an inveterate draftsman, sketching continually, even during his recreations and walks. Like most artists of the time, Watteau worked from live models. He departed from his contemporaries, however, in how he posed them. Eschewing the repertoire of poses borrowed from classical sculpture that formed the bedrock of academic practice, he depicted his models, as his friend the Comte de Caylus put it, in attitudes that nature presented to him, preferring those that were the most simple. Watteau concentrated his attention on two kinds of studies, all executed in red chalk. Those exploring how soldiers rest, and those exploring how they move. The persistence with which he probed these themes and the variety he managed to find within them are remarkable. In the first category, we find images of soldiers lying flat on their bellies, slumped over, leaning on their hands, burying their heads in their arms, or looking dreamily into the distance. It's safe to say that no artist devoted so much attention to the various ways men position themselves in repose. The drawings in the second category, those depicting movement, are no less attuned to the body's subtle changes in position and pose. This group of 5 extraordinary drawings, each showing a single soldier in 3 poses, are notable for their attention to the subtle variations of the movements of the body as it sways and shifts through space. Although the two categories of drawings appear dissimilar, one concentrating on stasis, the other on movement, they are united in their humaneness and intimacy. Shown in moments of withdrawal and absorption, Watteau's soldiers are not defined by their role as soldiers, but by their individuality. Indeed, what most attracts Watteau in these drawings, as one art historian has put it, are the individual private moments in his military subject's existence. Those brief moments of time when a soldier can, in the dehumanizing context of war, have personal experiences, when he can experience himself as a subject. The artist's interest in his soldiers' inner lives is obvious in the studies of soldiers at rest. Their bodies show all the signs of a turn inward, of reflection, concentration, distraction, sleep, reverie, moments when they could immerse themselves in their thoughts and feelings and fantasies. Looking at these figures who show little awareness either of the others on the page or of the beholder, with their bodies vulnerable and exposed, we have almost the sense of intruding on a private moment. Watteau's investment in interiority is perhaps less obvious in his studies of soldiers and movement. Yet here, too, I would suggest, their postures suggest a retreat into the self. For instance, the soldiers in this sheet from the Louvre, probably a single soldier drawn in different poses, seem not only unaware of the artist's presence, but appear almost to be stealing themselves away from his gaze. Rather than expressing heroic action or demonstrating drills, their enigmatic movements communicate a sense of absorption in their experience of their bodies, a self-sufficiency that excludes the presence of others. Watteau's focus on his soldiers' inner lives has its roots in momentous changes in the way the self was conceived around the end of the 17th century. As literary historian Jean Dejean has argued, the crucial years between 1660 and 1715, particularly in France, saw nothing short of a revolution in human subjectivity. If the passions had, since antiquity, been seen as external forces acting on a passive subject, now they're increasingly understood as the core of identity, and a wide variety of philosophers, theologians, playwrights, and novelists developed a new vocabulary of affect, charting psychological territory hitherto unexplored. Their efforts helped carve out, for the first time in a secular context, a new conceptual space in which the self could be examined, discussed, and understood. For the writer Charles Perrault, it was precisely the emergence of such a space that marked the modernity of his age. And I'm quoting, "Just as anatomy has discovered in the hearts ducts, valves, fibers, movements, and symptoms of which the ancients had no knowledge, in the same manner, moral philosophy has discovered attractions, aversions, desires, and repulsions which the ancients never knew." This larger shift helps explain Watteau's focus, but the object of his gaze, the infantryman, the common soldier, was nonetheless at odds with prevailing attitudes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the rank and file were largely anonymous, forgotten behind the ideal of aristocratic honor they were enlisted to serve. Moreover, in the last years of Louis XIV's reign, the indifference to the common soldier was compounded by changes in the way warfare was conceived and conducted. Earlier, Louis XIV himself often led his troops into battle, or else entrusted decisions to his generals on the field. But as he grew older, he withdrew from the battlefield and managed every detail of war from behind his desk at Versailles. War became a science, a mechanized, rational system. One military treatise from the period, for example, promised its readers a theory of war independent of practice that explains everything related to it in such a detailed and easy way that just by studying it and without leaving one's office, any attentive man could learn to apply these true principles to all the movements that is necessary for troops to perform. Sentiments like this meant that the common soldier, already faceless, was largely bypassed by the period's interest in interiority. From this perspective, Watteau's military works broke new ground. If Louis XIV transformed war into an abstract system that operated according to rational rules, Watteau drew the remainder of his effort, the human subjective element at the margins of the state's war machine. He pulled the common soldier from the oblivion to which he had been consigned, focusing precisely on the individual experiences that were otherwise discounted or neglected. While Watteau was visiting Valenciennes, he likely had close contact with the many soldiers stationed nearby, and the intimacy of his drawings, I believe, testify to the impact of his encounters. As the art historian Hal Opperman has pointed out in a pioneering article, Watteau's efforts seem to have a kinship with the nascent pacifist movement, led by the Dauphin's former tutor, François Fénelon, that brought new attention to the plight of the common soldier, to his suffering, and to his individuality. I would go even further and claim that they might even be linked to the subsequent push for reform in the middle of the 18th century that would transform prevailing attitudes towards the common soldier. The leaders of this campaign, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about human rights and autonomy, saw soldiers no longer as cogs in a machine, but as what one scholar has called soldats sensibles, sensitive soldiers, men whose physical and psychological suffering and the punishing conditions of military life demanded study and care. Even lowly infantrymen were now recognized as complex individuals with needs, desires, and rights. Watteau's attempt to give visual form to his military subjects' inner experience, it seems to me, were an early expression of this shift. Drawing in the impermeable self. Now, having said that, it would be a mistake to see Watteau as some kind of enlightened reformer, confident that the psyche of the soldier would yield itself as an object of knowledge and improvement. While he acknowledges, in a way that no previous artist had, his soldier's subjectivity, his drawings betray a more complex attitude about the intelligibility of the interior self. The late 17th century's investigation of the human heart fostered a dream of transparency between self and other, in which the contents of one's inner life could open for sympathetic identification. A more or less direct line leads from this attitude to the emergence of the soldat sensible in the middle of the 18th century. But this was far from the only view on the matter. Just as the human heart was established as an object of knowledge, there emerged a new skepticism about its legibility. A closer examination of Watteau's studies reveals they in fact engage the skeptical current far more than has previously been acknowledged. The drawings pivot on the intersubjective exchange between self and other that fired the affective revolution of the turn of the century. Yet far from confirming the total accessibility of the human heart, they reveal that perfect knowledge of the other is impossible, that the dream of transparency is just that, a dream. Now, to flesh out how they do so, I would like to revisit the well-worn comparison between Watteau and Charles Lebrun, the most influential French painter of the second half of the 17th century. And in doing so, I'm treading on territory already covered by the art historian Norman Bryson in his important study. Contrary to his reputation as a cold and inflexible rationalist, no artist better exemplifies his age's discovery of the interior self better than Lebrun. Indeed, for the painter's contemporaries, his commitment to reasoned principles was the source of his painting's affective power. In his landmark lecture on the Passions, given at the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 1668, Lebrun proposed a revolutionary system of expression. Drawing on the work of Descartes, the artist argued that the movements of the face were the external manifestations of the internal movements of the soul. Once the mechanisms of the soul's movements and the resulting effects on the exterior were discovered, the face could become a legible because universal sign of emotion. To this end, he produced schematic renderings of the movements of the face that correspond to various emotions. And I'm showing you here horror, astonishment, and hope. Artists, Lebrun anticipated, could use these facial types to endow their canvases with an emotional life immediately accessible to their audiences. Lebrun's own painting, The Family of Darius at the Feet of Alexander, which he would later draw on his lecture on the Passions, exemplifies the potential of his system. Here, Lebrun portrays the moment when Alexander, fresh from his triumph over the Persian emperor Darius at Issus, enters the encampment of the queens of Persia with his general, Hephaestion. Lying prostrate at Alexander's feet, the queens plead to him for clemency. Every face, every expression here is calibrated to reveal the emotions of the figures to the spectator, an intention borne out in a text by the art theorist André Philibien, published in 1663, where he claims to read, with perfect clarity, the expressions of each of the figures and the emotions they signify. If Darius' wife, for example, is a woman in blue holding her son, this woman here, he asserts, one sees in her eyes and on her whole face the manifest unhappiness about the condition to which she has been reduced. And one can even discover in her eyes and in all her features the hope she has in the clemency of so generous a conqueror. This was the dream of perfect affective legibility fulfilled. With Lebrun's rational universal rules, the inner states of any figure in a narrative painting could be rendered through the exterior, through the face. If Lebrun embodied the normative approach to representing interiority, Watteau, working outside the confines of history painting and the comparative freedom of genre painting, takes another tack. He eschews head studies of soldiers altogether, and what we see of their features yields little information. More often not, their small faces are obscured, turned to the side, or buried in their arms. But even when he shows us one head-on, as in this drawing, it appears almost affectless, eyes, eyebrows, and lips suggested by a few cursory lines. The contrast with a more traditional study of a classical soldier by Watteau's older contemporary Antoine Coppel, Lebrun's successor as director of the Royal Academy and first painter to the king, is striking. Coppel's drawing, adopted from Lebrun's drawing of anger and destined for use in a scene from Virgil's Aeneid, depicts a rictus of rage, muscles tensed, eyebrows scowling, every movement carefully registered to distill the soldier's emotion. Proposing parity between interior and exterior, it illustrates Coipel's belief that he wrote in a lecture to the Academy, that art must probe the deepest sentiments of the heart to render them visible to the eyes of men. Watteau's soldiers, by contrast, are remarkable for their opacity. Their faces reveal nothing about the contents of their minds, about their thoughts, emotions, and desires. And this opacity is just as striking when we compare it to a more closely related a study of a soldier destined for use in a genre scene in military life by his follower Jean-Baptiste Pater. Even if it doesn't aim as high as Lebrun and Coipel's works, Pater's soldier, with its comic mien, is something of a one-liner. Watteau shows us something far more inscrutable. Clearly, Watteau is aiming at something fundamentally different from Lebrun and his followers, and even from his own followers, such as Pater. His drawings, his studies of soldiers at rest with their buried heads and prostrate bodies, and soldiers on the march with their turned, hunched backs, represent not the contents of their subject's interiority, but rather the condition of self-reflexive withdrawal, not a single emotion distilled on the face, but the subject's immersion in the chaotic profusion of emotions that coexist in the interior. The result is that with Watteau, we are left with no access to the self, to the interior that defines individuality. The drawings betray a gulf that is opened up between the artist and the subjects he depicts. This gap, I would argue, is symptomatic of a growing conviction at the turn of the 18th century about the central disjunction between exterior and interior, appearance and reality. Lebrun's conception of art and selfhood is inextricable from the courtly ethos in which he worked, an ethos in which every gesture, every expression, every raised eyebrow or curl of the lip became a sign to be deciphered in a never-ending quest for visibility and favor. And yet, what information did the face really yield? A perfect courtier, the moralist Jean de la Bruyère cautioned, is a master of his gestures, his eyes, and his countenance. He is profound, impenetrable. He seems to overlook every injury, smiles at his enemies, controls his temper, disguises his passions, belies his heart, speaks, acts against his sentiments. From this perspective, the face was really a mask, its expressions a lie, and the foundations on which a system like Lebrun's stood, it hardly needs saying, were revealed to be shaky indeed. As writers like La Bruyère recognized, the inner life of others was essentially inaccessible. Watteau's drawings, I want to suggest, evince a similar awareness of the distance between a person's social facade and the inner life that it conceals. The face is no longer a window through which we can peer into the core of others' identities, but an opaque screen. And perhaps Watteau's immersion in the military camps during his stay in Valenciennes were a rawer study of humanity, not only stripped of courtly artifice, but outside the discipline required for drills in battle was possible, paved the way for his refusal to make the body or the face a legible sign. In any case, I want to emphasize that his refusal amounts to more than a simple rejection of Lebrun's grammar of the passions as so many artificial masks. It points rather to a rejection of the whole notion of selfhood that undergirds Lebrun's theory of expression, the idea that our inner lives can be discovered and represented through rational a priori methods. What alternative vision of selfhood, then, do Watteau's drawings propose? The art historian Evelia Burkhardt has recently linked Watteau's drawing practice and the understanding of the self on which it turns to the philosophical current of empiricism, which holds that we acquire knowledge not through deduction from first principles, but through the senses. This seems to me a crucial insight. Whether recording the body as it moves through space and time, or observing the minute variations of its resting states, Watteau aimed to depict the figure as it appeared to him in the moment he observed it. Its multiple reality, as the art historian Marianne Roland-Michel put it. Unfiltered through the kind of assumptions that Lebrun's lessons implanted in other artists, his drawings aim to register an unmediated sensual encounter with his subjects. With the quickness and vitality of their line, they exhibit an immediacy that preserves the sense of the moment, of the dynamic convergence between artist and model. Watteau's empiricism, however, raises a crucial question about the artist's relationship to the subjectivity of his subjects, so to speak. Now, Lyra Burkhardt sees Watteau's empiricism through the lens of David Hume. For her, Watteau's drawings reflect his view that personal identity is a fiction, that we are, in effect, nothing but a series of fleeting sensory impressions. Yet I see in Watteau's focus on moments of withdrawal and private experience an acknowledgement of exactly the kind of coherent, interiorized self rejected by Hume. So to begin to flesh out an answer to the question of the artist's relation to the interiority of his subjects, I'd like to turn instead to the ideas of John Locke, Watteau's contemporary and one of the founders of empiricism. According to Locke, when we speak of identity, we must distinguish between two parts, man and person. Man is the material substance of a human being, and man remains the same man only when his body persists over time. By contrast, a person is, in Locke's words, a thinking being that has reason and reflection and consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking. What Locke's talking about, in other words, is a being defined by its interiority. It is, he concludes, in the person alone that identity resides, for, he says, consciousness alone makes self. To illustrate his theory and its implications, Locke introduces a parable about a prince and a cobbler. Suppose, he says, that the soul of a prince were one day to enter the body of a cobbler. Since consciousness alone makes a person, the man would remain a cobbler, but the person would now be the prince. The consequence of this, however, is that the prince would be a prince only to himself. All others, judging by external appearance, would continue to see him as the cobbler. The self, then, this is the lesson I'm taking, is that the self is only knowable to itself. Others can only perceive the matter that makes man. We don't know whether Watteau read Locke, but it is possible. A French translation of an essay concerning human understanding, where the philosopher developed his theory of identity, was published in 1700 and quickly took Paris by storm, particularly in the circles Watteau would later frequent. Whatever the exact nature of their connection, though, I don't wish to portray Watteau's drawings in any way as illustrations of Locke's theories. Philosophy doesn't stand prior to Watteau's practice, which then simply reflects it. Rather, what is remarkable is that each, structured by a similar understanding of the subject's place in the world, is getting at the same thing. From this perspective, while Locke's ideas about identity don't explain Watteau's art, they're useful for the way they illuminate the central problem with which his drawings wrestle, and they allow us to articulate that in terms specific to the period. By the nature of their work, artists deal in appearances in the sensible world of matter. But this means that when depicting human subjects, they have access only to the man. The core of identity, the person, is out of reach. Seen from this Lockean perspective, Watteau's drawings register a kind of failure, though, as I will argue, a productive one. The poses and attitudes of his soldiers indicate their immersion in their inner lives, yet the contours and contents of that life are frustratingly inaccessible. The soldiers present to us only their withdrawn, affectless faces and their shell-like bodies, huddled against the intrusions of the world. Far from the dream of encounter between two sympathetic selves, equal and open, the drawings capture the meeting of an artist and an opaque and unknowable other. From drawing to painting. Unlike his drawings, of course, Watteau's military scenes do not depict isolated individuals. They show social situations, soldiers and sometimes their families, friends, and hangers-on, talking, smoking, drinking, and playing cards. But I want to suggest that what we've observed at the heart of the drawings, this unknowability of the other, nonetheless persists in the paintings. To understand how it does so, we need to look more closely at how Watteau went about making his paintings. As taught by the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture at the beginning of the 18th century and practiced by nearly every established artist of the time, the steps to a finished painting followed an established path. And I'm going to show you Lebrun's Jesus Carrying the Cross as an example. The painter began in high Platonic fashion with an idea, a mental image of the composition appropriate to the subject he wished to depict. From there, he would create compositional sketches, known as esquisses de pensée, to work out the overall shape his work would take and the disposition of its various elements. Next, he would make studies of the individual figures in various details such as hands and faces, often working from live models, whom he would pose, drawing on famous antique and Renaissance prototypes, according to their role in the composition. Finally, he would create a modello or cartoon, a finished model of the composition from which he would work to create his painting. And I don't have a modello for this, but this is the finished painting. Watteau, who was not trained by the Academy, broke from this path entirely. In the first place, he made almost no compositional drawings. And in the case of his military works, none that we can say with certainty are compositional drawings at all. Instead, he began with his studies from life. As his friend Caylus writes, he never made esquisse or pensée for any of his paintings. His custom was to draw his studies in a bound book, so that he always had a large number of studies at hand. As a result, the process of painting took on a spontaneous, almost aleatory logic, without appeal to a master idea. Caylus again. When it took his fancy to paint a picture, he turned to his collection of studies, from which he chose figures that suited him best at the moment. He continues, from these he made various groups, most often to accord with the background he had already conceived or prepared. He rarely made use of them in any other way. The sheet we saw earlier from the Boimans and the paintings for which it was employed show the artist's process in action. On the right of the drawing, Watteau has drawn 4 studies of soldiers, each in different positions of repose. The top figure lies flat on his belly, his head resting on his arms. Below him, a second soldier is shown tending to his musket. Further down, we see a man propping himself up on his arms, lost in thought. And at the bottom of the page, another soldier with a musket is shown, leaning on his right arm, looking on the verge of falling asleep. On the left, an elegantly dressed woman, probably drawn later than the soldiers, stands regally out as she looks at the viewer. We can relate the figures on the sheet to 2 of the military paintings. All 4 soldiers appear in the respite from war. These figures here. And the dreamy soldier, resting his head on his hand, makes another appearance in the supply train over here. Drawn as independent studies on the page, the figures have no obvious relationship to each other, but on the canvas, the situation has changed. In the process of composing the respite from war, for example, Watteau brought together the 4 soldiers together in a way he had presumably not foreseen when he first sketched them. The 2 men with muskets now sit leaning into each other. The sleeping man lies to their right, just behind them, and the man resting his face on his hands is shown to their left. As the soldiers migrate from sketchbook to canvas, their new proximity generates relationships not present in the sketch. The soldier resting his head on his hand, for example, appears almost lost in reverie in the drawing. Yet in the respite from war, the same figure now seems to be gazing at the sleeping soldier on the other side. What exactly is the nature of these relationships? The art historian Mary Vidal has argued that the military scenes evince a strong sense of social cohesiveness, and that warm companionship and revitalizing conversation always dominate Watteau's sympathetic, refined view of the soldier's life. While I don't deny that sociability in the midst of war is a central theme of Watteau's scenes, even our cursory look at the figures in the respite from war suggests a more complex social landscape. Is the man leaning on his hand actually gazing at the sleeping soldier, or is he merely facing his direction, lost in reflection and reverie, as he appears to be in the sketch? Even though Watteau shows us the trappings of communion, the exact nature of the relationship is far from clear. Ambiguous relationships like this proliferate in Watteau's military paintings. And the halt is a case in point. The figures in the canvas are connected by a network of gazes. The officer in red on the left glares at the man tending to his horse, while an elegantly dressed woman in yellow, perhaps his wife, wives were a common sight in early modern military camps, looks towards the woman next to her. Meanwhile, a soldier with his arm in a sling on the other side of the tree seems to be staring across the canvas at the pair of women, as soldiers on either side of the tree look down at nowhere in particular, and on the far right, another soldier gazes at a man sleeping next to him. Various groups of conversing soldiers populate the background, rounding out a scene that seems to be brimming with social life. Far more so than anything that we see in the relatively placid scenes of Watteau's forerunner, Valverman. Yet a closer look shows that this is perhaps not the scene of social cohesion and warm companionship it at first appears to be. Many of the figures, such as the man resting his head on his hand to the left of the tree, seem lost in their own world. And even when one figure looks towards another, it is not clear that the gaze is returned or that a real connection has been made. Take, for example, the soldier on the far right looking down at the sleeping man with head in his hands, or the soldier with the sling looking towards the women. Even the gaze of the women themselves do not seem quite to match up. The lack of connection here, I would suggest, is the direct result of Watteau's working method. Rather than being conceived as parts of a predetermined whole, as elements of a coherent composition that Watteau had already begun to work out, The figures in the painting were executed first as independent and unrelated studies, four sheets of which we can relate directly to the work, and I'll show them briefly to you now. Watteau likely executed these studies at different times, and only later did he return to them to create his painting, choosing various figures and drawing them into different relations. Let's consider, for example, the 5 soldiers in the foreground, the 4 to the right of the tree, and the one just to the left of it. The men here are taken from 2 sheets. These 2 are from a now lost drawing, and these 3 soldiers are from this drawing in Paris. In the drawings, the figures do not seem to have any narrative or affective relationship to each other, though I will note the pregnant exchange between the two men here. Who may have been drawn at different times, though. And in fact, the 2 soldiers in the missing drawing are likely the same man in different positions, as are the 3 soldiers in tricorn hats in the drawing in the bottom right. But out of these fragments, Watteau has built a whole social world on the canvas. With the exception of the standing and sleeping soldiers, he has shuffled all the figures, breaking some apart and placing others together in new relationships. The result is a marked tension between the soldiers' solitary state in the drawing and their interplay in the paintings. Because of the unusual way Watteau used his studies, they appear almost like puzzles made from pieces that do not quite fit together. Far from preserving the naturalism of his drawings, then, Watteau's working method undoes it, introducing an almost surreal disjunction among the figures. The soldiers stand in proximity to one another, many times even interacting, but disposed in almost arbitrary groupings, they rarely appear to connect. This sense of communion forestalled is particularly pronounced in the Portal of Valenciennes, and we know of three drawings related to the work. 2, now lost, from which Watteau has taken the figure of the seated soldier with a pipe and the soldier on the far right, and another now at the Courtauld Art Galleries, whose central figure the artist has used for the standing soldier with the cape at the far left. Here again, the remnants of the soldier's previous isolation on the page persists. Because they were not originally drawn or conceived as engaging with one another, their gazes never meet convincingly. They look towards each other, certainly, but it's not clear that they look at each other. Perhaps the faint smiles of the 2 men in the center, barely hinted at by a few strokes of Watteau's brush, suggest a desire for connection, conversation, or camaraderie, perhaps. But the obscured faces of the other standing men offer no indication about whether this desire is reciprocated and a connection has been made. Meanwhile, the 3 other figures, one sleeping, another facing away from us, and the last casting his eyes downward, have withdrawn completely into themselves, oblivious to the others around them. What appears on first inspection to be a scene of conviviality in the painting thus gives way to a series of failed connections, a vision of an uneasy and troubled social commerce. Failed connections like these are evident even in Watteau's paintings of soldiers on the march, where the figure's psychic isolation stands at odds with their collective movement forward. Recruits going to join the regiment, which survives as an etching after a now lost painting, in a rare first state by Watteau's hand alone, as well as a second state retouched by Henri-Simon Thomassin, is a particularly dramatic example. The work boasts a large number of related studies, the most remarkable of which is a series of 5 which I showed earlier, though not all the figures, should be noted, appear in the recruits. Drawn as studies of a single soldier in motion and deployed to represent several different men, the figures seem, in the new context of the etching, to be pulling away from each other rather than moving together. As a depiction of a march, the work makes little sense. With the soldiers counterposed by balletic movements, the procession would soon break apart. But as an evocation of the psychic break between 2 uncomprehending selves, it takes on new significance. Despite their proximity and shared destination, their experiences remain theirs alone, closed off within the swaying shells of their bodies. The effect of recruits going to join the regiment and the others we've looked at stand in sharp contrast to a painting like Lebrun's Family of Darius. Here, Lebrun's figures are linked by an effective chain that endows the canvas with an emotional unity absent in Bateau. As Félibien writes of the Queen in Blue, one clearly sees that in looking at Alexander in the way she does, she attempts with her looks, which are the interpreters of her sadness, to make the soul of this prince capable of compassion. Conceived as parts of a unified pictorial composition, Lebrun's expressive faces facilitated this kind of sympathetic bond, the meeting of two sensitive hearts dreamed of by his contemporaries, between the figures and the canvas. Of course, like Watteau's studies, these were originally independent motifs as well, but unlike Watteau's stock of motifs, they correspond to fixed passions and functioned almost like syntactic units. When brought together, they generated narrative and connected the figures at an emotional level. By contrast, since Watteau's studies expressed only an empirical reality of his soldiers, disassociated from their inner lives, their faces and bodies mean nothing. They are independent figures, not narrative units like Lebrun's heads. They do not, as the artist friend Jean de Julien wrote, need to be supported by the composition of a larger subject. As a result, the kind of emotional connection that Félibien sees as the driving force behind Lebrun's painting is nearly impossible to imagine in Bateau's scenes. Thus, as we saw in the Portal of Valenciennes, the soldiers stand near each other, half acknowledging their companions or else completely withdrawn, but they all remain to one degree or another enclosed in their own worlds. Ripped from their isolation in a sketchbook, they are forced into uneasy contact, as unknowable to each other as they appear to be to Watteau's gaze in the original studies. In Lockean terms, we see man encountering man rather than person encountering person. In this way, the artist's vision of the self, with its stress on the autonomy and opacity of the other's interiority, persists through each stage of creation. Now, it might be objected that the disjunctive qualities of Watteau's paintings are merely the result of Watteau's lack of academic training and the unconventional ways he made his painting as a result, not the product of some kind of intended strategy. And in fact, I agree, but I don't think that's the whole story. Artistic process has, I've been intimating, an epistemological dimension. It is a mode of thinking not reducible to an intention or thought that stands before it or outside it. I'm not claiming that Watteau was an intellectual, a peintre savant in the way that Lebrun was. My point, rather, is that inherent in his working methods is a certain understanding of the world and the people in it, and that those working methods themselves have meaning. I'm claiming that Watteau's military works not just depict a certain relationship between subjects, but are structured by that relation. The experience of alterity is the logic of his procedure, shaping his process from initial sketch to finished painting. The drawings served as the building blocks for a whole architecture of irresolution and ambiguity in the paintings, where the ideal of social cohesion they appear to depict teeters always on the edge of collapse. And in what time remains, I'd like to explore how the artist's unusual technique also shapes the way the beholder experiences his pictures. Watteau's older contemporary, Charles Perrault, whom I cited earlier, claimed that in painting, the naive expression of the movements of the soul go directly to the soul of the viewer, and impressing on it the same passions it sees represented gives it a very lively pleasure. And this idea goes as far back, at least to Alberti, and would, just before Watteau's death, form the basis of modern aesthetics in the work of the Abbé Dubos, who would publish his critical reflections on poetry and painting in 1720. For Dubos, aesthetic experience was based in the identification of the spectator with the passions represented on the canvas, creating phantom passions that would make even the most painful emotions diverting and agreeable. Lebrun and Coipel's pictures sought to incite this kind of pleasure, drawing spectators into the emotional world of the painting through the displacement of the interior onto the exterior. Such a pleasure, however, is clearly not available in Watteau. And recruits going to join the regiment, for example, the eye travels along the graceful arabesque of figures, gliding across the opaque surfaces that enclose the soldier's interiority, but emphatically never able to enter into it. Rather than delivering spectators totally into the scene, thereby rendering painting as a kind of screen for identification and projection, the work pushes the spectator away. This, I suggest, marks a new modern relationship to the work of art. Our experience of painting in Watteau is not reducible to the identification with depicted passions or the pleasure that would provoke, but a more complex dialogue between painting and spectator. Alienated from the content of the painting, viewers are invited to turn back on themselves, to retreat into reverie created out of the play between their imagination and the enigmatic scenes depicted on the canvases. From this perspective, we can perhaps better understand what attracted Watteau's contemporaries to his military paintings, which were among his most popular works. Some scholars have attempted to see in Watteau's paintings a commentary on Louis XIV's militancy, and it would be hard to deny that they register something of the psychic toll of war. And it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to suggest that the gentlemen officers who admired and collected Watteau's works appreciated the way they reproduced their own psychological distance from the experience of the lowly infantrymen who served under them. Nor, on a broader level, would it be implausible to claim that the works visualize, subtly, the social atomization that brought about by the War of the Spanish Succession. But the significance of the military works, I believe, surpasses their subject matter. The military scenes of 17th century Holland provided Watteau with a platform to probe larger questions that his predecessors' Aeneid works did not. I'm thinking of Valverman here. The lack of connection among the soldiers depicted in his military works serves ultimately as a meditation on what it means to be an individual in society. It dramatizes the new territory that was emerging between the public and private realms at a moment when the conflicting demands of each became increasingly apparent. Too small to be viewed comfortably by more than one person, Watteau's canvases were meant for the individual, for contemplation, the sort of intimate cabinet, small rooms for private retreat that were then becoming fashionable. Undoing the fiction of intersubjective transparency and perfect social cohesion proposed by Lebrun and Coipel, they elicited a new kind of experience, one that spoke to a society in the midst of massive intellectual and cultural upheaval that marked the early Enlightenment. And in this light, it shouldn't be surprising that much of what I've observed in Watteau's military scenes also obtains his more famous fêtes galantes. Note, for instance, in Divertissement Champêtre, with which I opened, the lovers' gazes that never quite meet, the connections that never seem quite resolved. I have argued that the theme of military life occupied a special place in Watteau's vision of subjectivity for the way it pushed the issue of the gap between self and other to an extreme. But the content of the Fête Galante also provided a point of access to the issue. I would venture that the problem of the opacity of others' inner lives is perhaps even more glaring here, since it is tested by the relationship that promises to dissolve the boundary between self and other, love. War and love, then, are not so dissimilar in Watteau's universe. For if love joins people together, so does war, not only for companionship, but more fundamentally for survival. In this sense, I would say that both the military works and the Fête Galante offer a vision of coexistence within a community, but it is a fragile coexistence. It is the way they capture this that gives Watteau's works their poignancy, shaped as they are by the essentially modern insight that society is held together by only the thinnest of threads, that our connections are menaced by mutual incomprehension and estrangement. Yet as Watteau understood, the very existence of society and the realms of military life and courtship alike depends on our forging ahead anyway. Thank you.